I'm just having a lovely day, being Jones. Oh my God.
Hello everybody and welcome to CaiKeys. And today I'm here in the Nissan Almera. So this is the second generation of Nissan Almera and this was introduced in the year 2000. Looked very, very similar to the first generation Nissan Almera, but this was produced on a different platform. The first generation Nissan Almera also had quite possibly the worst or best tagline of any advertising campaign ever, especially for a car. The Nissan Almera Mark 1 was badged as the car they don't want you to drive, which, as far as I'm concerned, sounds terrible. I'm not sure they intended it to sound terrible, but it certainly did. Anyway, the Nissan Almera petrol engines came for 1.5, a 1.6 or a 1.8 litre. This is the 1.5, and as you saw from the introduction of this video, the car feels sprightly enough. Surprising. The thing is about the Nissan Almera, when I did my second ever review on CaiKeys on the Volkswagen Golf Mark 5, I described it as a car of all time, a car with no real, not so much redeeming qualities, but nothing really remarkable about it. And I think I might have used that phrase far too soon, because I think that the Nissan Almera is perhaps another one of those candidates. The Nissan Almera Mark II was actually produced until 2007, and my God, it must have felt very outdated. What you do get on certain models that this has is a really ugly monochrome screen. It's very Vauxhall, actually. You also get a flashing airbag light. Oh, the engine light's gone off, but the car's trying to bamboozle me. This thing does not run particularly well. So this Nissan Almera was, until very recently, owned by Connor Jones. You know him, we all know him, Connor Jones. And Connor purchased this car approximately a year ago, slightly less, as just a little commuter to get him from A to B. But why exactly did he choose the Nissan Almera? I think the clutch is going. Why exactly did he choose the Nissan Almera? Well, it's because he'd had a Nissan Almera previously. I believe it was his granddad's car, and he looked after that thing. But that was a good car. He enjoyed it. It was reliable. It was fairly refined. It got him to and from his place of work and never set a foot wrong. He really enjoyed that car. Unfortunately, Connor Jones's first Nissan Almera had an unfortunate end. As whilst he was away from the vehicle, he had it parked up in, I believe it was Blackpool, and he returned to find his first Nissan Almera, which was just like this but silver and not ragged. It had disappeared, unfortunately. So out set the quest to find Connor Jones's Mark II Nissan Almera. They eventually found it, but it had been turned into a cube and was lying around in a scrapyard somewhere. So Connor was the unfortunate victim of theft. So eventually Connor started looking for new vehicles. He didn't need one immediately, but he did eventually get around to it. And he saw a few vehicles. He saw a Mark III Ford Fiesta, which looked great, but unfortunately it was not. It was absolutely rotten, and really in his heart he hoped for another Nissan Almera because he really did enjoy that first car. And then he found this. Oh God. This is kind of the definition of a necessity, a necessary car. I mean, in a similar vein to my Toyota Yaris, this is a car that you don't get because you really want it. You get a car like this because you need a car and you don't have sufficient funds for anything else. Make no mistake, viewer, this is not the kind of Nissan Almera that he originally had. Similar to when I had my Rover 75, which I reviewed on the channel, it simply wasn't as good as my first one. That being said, despite the fact that this Nissan Almera is really on its last legs, there is a great... You can see that this, when it's not in terrible condition, is a genuinely decent car. Is it as good as the Ford Focus Mark 1? Well, that's something I want to come on to. It it's not actually a dissimilar car. Obviously, it's a C-segment hatchback. It's a compact car like the Ford Focus, and the Ford Focus came out in 1998. This came out in 2000, so they're of the same era. And having been in a few Mark 1 Ford Focuses, it's really a very similar car. Interior room is basically the same. Fit and finish of the interior quality, you know, when it actually holds together, is broadly similar. Refinement, if you ignore these funny noises coming from the front left, where something's going wrong, is similar. It's really not a bad car, but unfortunately there's not really that much history behind this car. The thing is, when Ford brought out the Focus, it revolutionised the hatchback market. It was a car that manufacturers wanted to imitate, and they never really bettered it. Ford set the standard, and Nissan really were doing much of the same when the Almera Mark II came out. It's got McPherson struts on the front and multi-link rear suspension on the rear, and I'm quite surprised at how well it does genuinely handle. There's minimal body roll, but there just simply isn't that much history behind the Almera Mark II. It was a fairly unexceptional car. They made these things up in Sunderland, and that's essentially all there is to this car. It's a forgotten vehicle. It's not the kind of thing that you hear much about anymore. So the Nissan Almera Mark II was actually one of the first vehicles to use a fair few Renault parts. Obviously, Nissan and Renault had a merger in the late 1990s, and they started sharing an awful lot of parts together, and that's sort of where a lot of Nissan's reputation really went downhill. I think that's unfair, but these do have Renault timing chains. Coincidentally, the Renault timing chains are one of the parts that fail on these vehicles. Failure rates aren't spectacular, but there are reports of timing chains snapping on these. But as far as all the forums go on this vehicle, there's not really any major issues. There is a fault with the immobiliser, where the immobiliser sometimes fails. That's what Mr. Jones thought was wrong with his vehicle when it wouldn't start one day. So what did he do? He removed the wheel, what's it bloody called? The steering column. He's removed the plastic from the bottom of the steering column because he'd heard that if you unplug this sensor, that can sometimes solve the issue. Turns out that the immobiliser wasn't actually the issue, and the issue was just that his battery was too small and from a Vauxhall for some reason. Don't know how that had ended up there. In fact, when he removed that plug and put it back in, the only thing that happened was that you got an airbag light on this vehicle, and that flashes a lot. I don't know whether it's a kind of blind nostalgia thing, but what I have personally noticed is that whenever you get another vehicle, it's never really the same as that first one that you owned. I don't know if you can relate in the comments if you've ever had two of the same cars, but you kind of build up this rose-tinted picture in your mind, and then you get another car, and then you see and you feel all the things that were just wrong about that first one that just become so much more apparent the second time, because you come into it with these amazing expectations of, wow, I used to love that car. I owned a Peugeot 406, greatest car I've ever had, 2.1 litre turbo diesel, phenomenal car, amazing sound system in it. Would I own another one? I don't know. I probably wouldn't, because having been stung by the Rover 75 and realising that it's an excellent car, but it just could never live up to that first one, I don't know if I'd get another. And I think it's the same with this Almera. It's an Almera at the end of the day, but it's simply a method of transportation. It's not special. It's not part of the Jones family. It's simply a commuter car. It's something to get you from A to B. When Connor returns from sea, he's very clear that this car is most likely going to be scrapped, which is a shame because it does still have a fair bit of life left. It also has a sentient gear stick, which is a feature that you don't see on many cars nowadays. You know, despite the fact that the gear shift is jumping around, it's clearly very worn, it's not a bad gear shift. Although, if you smash it into... I can move the entire centre console doing that. If I push down on the accelerator, I can feel the gear sticks sink into the floor. I don't know if that should happen. So the first generation Nissan Almera had a GTI version, a fast version. This generation of Nissan Almera did not. There was nothing really particularly interesting about this car. This is the kind of car that you don't even see on the roads anymore as pizza delivery vehicles or anything, and that's not really because it was a particularly bad car. I don't know why you don't see these things anymore, you just don't. They didn't seem to have horrific issues with rust, really. The front subframe on them tends to go, but aside from that, they're not particularly good or bad for the era. They're pretty much par for the course. Interestingly enough, the same cannot be said for the Mark I Ford Focus, which did notoriously rot out, but you still see quite a lot of those. So getting back to this screen in the middle, it's always something that's quite interested me about the Nissan Almera. I've wondered what exactly can this screen do. It's really quite boring. It's a climate control button, and I don't know how to use it because it's very confusing and antiquated. But that's another thing to be said for these cars. They did have a decent amount of kit inside them. Interior-wise in this, it's a lot less imaginative than the Ford Focus Mark I. There's this thing that I've noticed with Nissans around this era, that they still felt a little bit more restrained than the competition. If you watch a fair few of my other reviews, like on the Toyota Yaris that I reviewed the other week, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, car companies went a little bit silly with their dashboards. Everything was curved. There was no squares anywhere in them, and I'm not entirely sure if they've aged well or terribly. The Nissan Almera, similar to the Nissan Micra, which was my first video, inside, it's very, very business-like in here, very, very sensible. There's not really much to like or dislike about the thing. And I just think that it's bizarre that, in contrast to the weird exterior of lots of Nissans from this time, that their interiors would be so generic. Obviously, everything on this vehicle is very, very, very worn. I've just driven over some horrendous potholes. This road looks like it's been bombed, but even so, it's a comfortable car. It's not the kind of car that's made for actually getting you anywhere quickly. I suppose that with this car, you probably don't really want to hear how the thing handles. You want to know, is it reliable? Will it get me from A to B? Because if you are, for some reason, genuinely in the market for a Nissan Almera, first of all, don't buy it, get a Yaris instead. And second of all, you're not going to care about how exactly the thing drives. You're probably going to be looking for a cheap commuter to get you to work. I don't think you can go far wrong with this. As far as interior comfort goes, this thing's really good. It's very comfortable. The seat is very wide, actually, and you've got an awful lot of adjustability. You've actually got thigh support in here and lumbar support that's adjustable. For an economy car, these things are very well equipped, and this is a fairly base spec example. As for pedal feel, everything feels a little bit spongy in here. The accelerator feels like it has some resistance, as does the clutch, but it's very strange. It's very, I think spongy is the only way of describing it. It's not exactly a driver's car by any stretch of the imagination. This is one of those cars that you don't really treat very well. When you know what's going to happen to a car, when you know that it's going to end up being scrapped, when you know that it's not long for this world, you kind of get a little bit lax on maintenance. As I said, Connor has owned this car for approximately a year, and in that time it has not been serviced, and in that time it has been mistreated, but it still holds up and it still runs. I think there is something to be said for cheap cars like this, and I still think that Bangernomics is a financially, perhaps not sound, but a financially decent proposition if you're lucky. Look at the other review that I did the other week with the Citroen C3, which was not an Aircross, my apologies there. That's a car which is fairly new, fairly expensive, and still breaks down. Those 1.2 litre 3 cylinders have horrendous problems with wet belts and oil consumption. The Nissan Almera is a car that, okay, fine, it's a little bit antiquated. This is a terrible example, and it's 'it's borderline biohazard material back here, but it's a car that will get you from A to B, and it's so much cheaper than lots of less reliable modern alternatives. There's nothing, if you get a good example that's been well maintained and looked after and has service history and everything, there's absolutely no reason that an old car cannot be just as reliable or more reliable than a modern car. And I hate this sense from people that there is something wrong with older cars. There's not. This is maybe not the best vehicle to be making this impassioned plea from. Yeah, the clutch on this sits very high, and I've decided to drive it to like the hilliest area around Ramsbottom. Oh, we have an ashtray. Let's look at the interior kit we get. So we get the most confusing climate control system in the world. We get a multifunction steering wheel. We get wiper controls, which I've just noticed may be the same as that in my Nissan Elgrand, which really brings down my reputation of the Elgrand, my god. But part sharing, there's nothing wrong with that. You have the same gauges that are in my Elgrand. Oh god. You have the world's most stupid cup holders that are right in front of your gear stick, so you can't actually fit anything in them without knocking it all over the place. You have a very adjustable seat. You have electric windows all round. Do they work? Look at that. Nissan reliability for you, that. The fact is that, look, whilst this car may be falling apart, it's mechanically solid and it gets him to and from C. What else do we have here? Oh, look at this. The Nissan Almera is now quite a cool car. There's also a very, very fitting patch here that's been Velcroed to the ceiling. Embrace the suck. You know what? I think that patch fully defines this car. Embrace the suck. Don't let other people tell... That truck almost rolled into me. Don't let other people tell you what you can and can't drive. If you want to get the shitbox Almera, then by all means do. If you think that you'll enjoy it, then do. If you want to get that Alfa Romeo that's going to break down, then do. Embrace the suck. Because what's the point in spending £20,000 on a new car when you're only going to be in it for a few hours per day, when you can get a car for, what, 1/40th of the price that may very well be just as reliable? Pot luck, it may not. I'm going to try and take this thing on some country roads and try and get some kind of something to talk about it, because there is nothing to this car that's interesting at all. The thing has virtually no history behind it. It's a cookie cutter washing machine of a car that really is going to be forgotten if it has not already been forgotten. I mean, who the hell remembers a Nissan Almera? Perhaps your nan used to have one when she used to poodle along to the garden centre, but she probably didn't. She probably had a Nissan Micra instead, which is a far more fun and responsive vehicle than this. It's not bad. I'm not trying to disparage the thing, but what I am saying about it is there is absolutely nothing really to this car from a historical point of view or from a driving pleasure point of view, but sometimes that's all you need. Hell, look at all the old British Leyland models in the 1970s and the 80s that you cannot remember, not because they were particularly good or bad, but because they were just they just kind of did the job. There's been thousands of these cars that everybody forgets. The Fiat Brava and the Fiat Bravo are perhaps my favourite example. The things don't exist anymore. You cannot find them. And they were adequate. They weren't terrible, but they were okay. No one's going to cry for the loss of them, and no one's going to cry for the loss of the Almera. Maybe it gets you to and from work and you really like these things. I don't know, perhaps, but there's just nothing interesting about this thing. There's nothing interesting in the way it drives. There's nothing interesting about the interior styling. There's nothing interesting about the history, except maybe for the fact that they were one of the first Nissans to use a fair few Renault parts. There's nothing particularly exciting that goes wrong on these things. This is the most basic commuter you can get. At least the Volkswagen Golf Mark V had a really cool bottle opener. This thing doesn't even have that. It has a stupid screen in the middle, which I don't know how to use, and I'm not going to try and figure out how to use it because I'll probably break something. what do I say? Welcome to the CaiKeys impassioned rant on the car they don't want you to drive. Why don't they want you to drive this? Is it because you'll die of boredom? How bloody long are these lights going to take? That's a slipping clutch. You know what? So even as I've taken this car up here for a bit of a drive, let's whack it on the motorway and see how it handles. I have been told actually that this car will cut out if you take corners in a certain way, so that gives me a sense of security. He said if you drop the clutch, oh, I don't know. Basically, if it happens at some point, it happens at some point. Wow, fifth gear is very low. I'm used to the Yaris, obviously, now it's my daily driver, but fifth gear in this, you're at about 1,250 RPM at 30 miles per hour. So let's see how it handles on the motorway. I'm expecting fairly good things. I'm obviously going to be comparing this thing to the Nissan Micra, and I don't like it as much. The driving position is better, to be fair. It feels lower. The cabin feels a little bit better screwed together, but it's not as fun. You don't get that scrabbly feeling for grip that you get in the Micra. You don't get that in this. It feels more refined, it feels more sensible. You could find these things in a saloon as well, which, you know, typical sales rep car, although try finding one of those, they virtually don't exist anymore. Regarding pace, it is adequate. To be fair, for a 1.5 litre engine, it really isn't too bad. It does shift. And you could get these all the way up to a 1.8 litre. I said there was no GTI model, but it's not that kind of car, it's a commuter car, and it's beyond adequate. Compared to my daily driver Yaris, this thing feels like a bit of a spaceship. Like I said, I'm not being particularly mechanically sympathetic to this thing because it's not long for this world. I don't know what that gear shifter's doing, but it's beginning to weird me out a little bit. Just bobbling along there. Noise, vibration and harshness. So at 70 miles per hour, we are at pretty much bang on 3,000 RPM, and it's not too bad in here, to be fair. There's a fair bit of engine noise intrusion into the cabin, but it's a fairly cheap car. Wind noise is okay. It's a curvy car, it's probably fairly aerodynamic, and it's not bad. There is nothing exceptional about this vehicle, as I've said many times before, and you're probably bored of me saying it now, but there's really nothing really to discuss with this car. I mean, for the time, you got a decent amount of equipment, like I said, but that equipment, especially if you get the digital display, is now antiquated. Some of the top spec models of these things had sat-nav, but yet again, what is the point of using old tech in a car like this when you have a phone that can do everything? These digital climate controls are unintuitive and clunky. You know, this is quarter-century old technology right now. This car comes from that era, really, where high-tech systems in cars at the time are not really usable now. And that's something I worry about cars right now. If you go and buy a 2024 Range Rover, top spec, you know, £100,000 with all the bells and whistles, in 10 years, how antiquated is that thing going to be? How laggy are those screens going to look compared to now? Is it going to be compatible with your phone? This car doesn't really have much tech, it's just the fairly clunky climate control which you need to get used to, and it's a car at the end of the day. I don't really want to sound like an old person per se. Well, not an old person, but a relic of a bygone age. It's not going... There we go. It's gone into first. I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but there's something to be said for a fairly reliable car that will get you from A to B, which you can fix in your own time. The engine bay in this thing is massive. And look at the whole front end of this car, it's very large. If you look underneath the bonnet, there's not really an awful lot going on under there. This is a car which you can do little odd jobs on fairly easily. This has an OBD2 port, as I was saying, but it's not played by computers everywhere. This thing doesn't have traction control. You don't need it in this. I think this isn't a car which I particularly like per se, but it's a car which I respect. It's not a car that I could end up liking. I don't think it's a car that I could really fall in love with, because at least the Toyota Yaris, which I'm daily driving right now, does have something interesting going for it, such as the absolutely bizarre styling. I need to be in that lane. The absolutely bizarre styling and the digital dashboard. That's something cool, it's something a little bit different, and plus it is base spec with rubber bumpers on white paint, which I really am quite a fan of. This thing, there's nothing exceptional to it, and it will be forgotten. It will be crushed and forgotten mercilessly. But I can respect that. Because look, at the end of the day, while some people may view cars as a member of the family, something to be cherished, like Connor's first Mark II Nissan Almera, other times they're just a tool. They're something to get you from A to B, and I think that's what they are to the average non-car person. Just a means to an end, generally, and sometimes there's nothing wrong with that. But for the love of God, I really hope that soon I can source some more interesting cars, because believe me, there is not too much to say about this vehicle. Jones was bigging up this car a little bit to me, to be fair. He was saying it drove surprisingly nicely. I disagree. I don't think it does drive surprisingly nicely. I think it drives pretty much exactly as you'd anticipate. The only thing that surprises me about the handling in this car is the minimal body roll, courtesy of the multi-link rear suspension and those front McPherson struts, and it's genuinely quite impressive. For a small hatchback, it handles really well. Does it handle any better than the contemporary Mark I Ford Focus? No. It's very similar. Probably a little bit worse, but that was an exceptionally well-handling car. The steering, it's fairly nicely weighted. There's nothing to condemn or condone really in this car. It is what it is. It is what it says on the tin. Room, this will seat 5 people. You're going to be a lot more comfortable with 4 people, but you can get 5 in there at a push. It's a stopgap. No one buys one of these because they're interested in it. If I do this, the gear stick goes all over the place. This is the kind of car that before we get it scrapped, we could probably afford to have a little bit of fun with it. It's a car which isn't particularly cared for. It's a car which the dealer may have slightly misled Mr. Jones when he was purchasing this thing. It's a car which he thought was going to be fairly good and has turned out to be reliable, bang on, but look, everything is kind of falling apart in this. It's a car which has not been very well looked after. I don't know if you can hear that noise towards the front of the car, but it sounds like crickets chirping, and that, I'd say in any other car that needs investigating, but in this, you just drive it over some potholes until that noise goes away, and if it doesn't go away, then you just turn up the radio. Can't really break traction on this thing. There's no real moment when that engine really springs into life. Usually it's around the 3,500 RPM mark when you really start getting into that power band. This, not really, and it's just started to make another funny noise. It's predictable, it's unremarkable, and it is acceptable. Don't know if you can hear that, but that sounds like, I don't know what that sounds like, but it doesn't sound right. It's like squealing, like I've got sticking brakes or something. I don't think I do. This isn't even a car that rewards you for driving in that power band, because there isn't really any. It's not slow, it's just not particularly engaging. It's not particularly fun. Then I'm banging it through the gears, and basically all that happens is the engine gets louder. Doesn't really lug too much at low RPMs, but it doesn't really sing at those high RPMs. Why have I gone back this way? I'm going to be stuck in this traffic jam again. Oh, there's another Almera there. It's not every day you see them. Or maybe actually, maybe you do see these every day, but because they're so generic, they're like a random GTA free car that you find in the city, you just don't remember the things. It could be that. I'm assuming it's that, because I see no reason for these things to be extinct. They're alright. A lot of older people tend to own these cars, and to be fair, what I've learned is always buy an old man car if possible. That smells like tyres. It doesn't smell like clutch, it does smell like tyres. It's like the steepest hill in the area, and I'm really not... Either the clutch in this feels terrible, or the clutch in this is dying. If the clutch in this was not dying, then it certainly is now. That smells awful. As far as I'm concerned, this is a 600, 800 pound car all over, in a similar vein to the Toyota Yaris, but at least the Yaris doesn't make weird noises, doesn't have a flashing airbag light, doesn't have a flashing check engine light, and doesn't, I don't know, it will actually get you where you're going. Look, a Beetle and an old Land Cruiser, far more interesting. There was a fair bit of criticism with this car actually regarding parking the thing, because it has a weirdly long front end. And look, another Almera. So these things actually do seem to be everywhere. It's just that you never actually notice them because they are white goods. Where is my council tax money going? Because this road is abysmal. Keep it, mate. See you in the next video. I'm getting the bus.